I need you to picture something. A room full of people who all know each other's last names. Crystal glasses, white florals, the kind of soft golden light that makes everyone look like they're living their best life. And right in the middle of it, me, in a dress I saved 3 months to buy, standing next to the man I love, being publicly introduced by my own mother as just a nurse with a boyfriend who farms. At least 50 people heard it. And the worst part? She smiled when she said it. Like it was charming. Like it was the kindest possible way to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly where I ranked. I couldn't believe I was standing there, humiliated in front of the very people my family had spent decades trying to impress. The betrayal wasn't new. I want you to understand that. It had been built slowly, over years, from 100 small dismissals dressed up as love. But something about that night was different. Something about having it said out loud. In that room, with those witnesses, it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And what none of them knew, not my mother, not my father, not a single guest at that party, was who was standing right next to me. The man they'd already written off as the poor farmer. The man who, before dinner even ended, would make the one person my parents never dared embarrass go completely still. Here's what I've learned about truth. It doesn't wait for the right moment. It doesn't care about your seating chart or your toast or the story you've been telling about your family for 30 years. The truth just arrives. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through cracks in the version of events you've been maintaining. And sometimes it walks in wearing a fitted suit, gets recognized by an appellate judge in front of 60 people, and rearranges the entire room without raising its voice. What happened that night was shocking. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simply, completely, undeniably real. The conditional nature of my family's love was finally visible. And once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. This is the story of how I was cheated out of basic dignity by the people who were supposed to protect it, and what happened when the truth showed up to dinner anyway. Stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. And I mean everything. I still remember the exact moment my smile froze on my face, like my whole body forgot how to function. There I was, standing in the middle of the most beautiful venue I'd ever seen, in a dress I'd saved up for 3 months to buy, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family. My mother looked right at me, right through me, actually, and laughed. She said it loud enough for at least a dozen people nearby to hear. "Oh, that's just Claire. She's a nurse, and her boyfriend works on a farm." The way she said it, like those were punchlines, like my entire life was something to be embarrassed about. I couldn't believe it. I stood there, cheeks burning, holding a glass of champagne like a prop in someone else's play. Dozens of guests turned their heads, some smiling politely, some whispering, and the humiliation settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water. My boyfriend, Marcus, stood beside me, calm, composed, almost unnervingly so, and squeezed my hand gently. He didn't say a word, but something in his eyes told me he'd seen this kind of moment before, and that he already knew how it would end. I didn't. Not yet. This wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel small at a family event, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't be the last, or so I thought. My family, the Hawthorns, had a certain image to uphold, a legacy of law partners, city council seats, and country club memberships that stretched back 2 generations. And then there was me, Claire Hawthorne, the one who chose bedside manner over billable hours, the black sheep who actually slept well at night. The betrayal I felt wasn't dramatic. It was slow, like water wearing down stone over years. What stung the most wasn't the laughter. It was the ease of it. My mother didn't hesitate. My father didn't intervene. My sister Natalie, the guest of honor, glowing in her engagement bliss, looked away. And in that split second, I felt every birthday ignored, every achievement dismissed, every time I told myself they just don't know how to show it, collapse into one brutal public truth. I was being shamed in front of witnesses, and not a single person in my corner spoke up. Except, maybe, the man standing right next to me. Because here's the thing nobody in that room knew. And I mean nobody. Marcus had been quiet all evening. Polite, a little reserved. The kind of man who listens more than he talks. My family had already written him off as some country boy who fixed fences for a living. They'd made their assumptions, flashed their smiles, and moved on. But as my mother's words still hung in the air, I caught something in the corner of my eye. Someone across the room had gone completely still. And that stillness? It was about to change everything. The Hawthorne name, in our city of Merritt Falls, carried weight the way old money always does, quietly, but everywhere. My grandfather had been a circuit court judge. My father, Richard Hawthorne, was one of the most recognized estate attorneys in the region, the kind of man whose name appeared on plaques inside marble buildings. My mother, Diana, ran their social life like a second career. Charity galas, alumni dinners, strategic friendships cultivated over decades. This was the ecosystem I was born into, and for a long time, I genuinely tried to belong to it. But I was never the right shape for their world. My older sister, Natalie, was. She went to law school, graduated top of her class, landed a position at a prestigious firm in the city, and then, as if to complete the fairy tale, got engaged to Thomas Ellsworth, whose family ran one of the oldest legal consultancies on the East Coast. The Hawthornes had found their golden child, and they polished her with everything they had. Meanwhile, I chose nursing, not because I failed at anything else. I didn't. I chose it because it meant something to me, because I wanted to look someone in the eyes during the worst moment of their life and actually help. That decision, quiet and personal as it was, became the invisible wall between me and my family. What followed wasn't a dramatic falling out. There were no slammed doors or screaming matches. Those would have almost been easier, more honest. What happened instead was subtler, and in some ways, more painful. I became background noise. My accomplishments, real and hard-earned, simply didn't register. The family dinner conversations revolved around case law, partnership tracks, and client acquisitions. I'd sit there, tired from a 12-hour shift, and try to find an entry point into conversations that weren't built for me. The backstabbing wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, woven into every seating arrangement and topic change. And yet, I kept showing up. That, looking back, might be the most revealing thing about me, or about what family betrayal does to you over time. You keep believing that if you just achieve enough, if you just show up consistently, eventually they'll see it. Eventually, the justice of being recognized will come naturally. I told myself that story for years. I carried it all the way to Natalie's engagement party, dressed in my best, with Marcus by my side, genuinely hoping that this time, would feel different. I was cheated out of that hope before the appetizers were even served. What I hadn't factored into that equation was Marcus. Specifically, who Marcus actually was, beyond what the eye could see. My family had already decided he was beneath their notice, a man with dirt on his boots and no seat at any important table. They looked at him the way people look at background extras in a film, present, but not quite real. And as I stood in that room absorbing my mother's casual cruelty, I had no idea that the very man they'd dismissed without a second glance was quietly holding a card that would flip this entire story on its head. If you've ever been the invisible one in a family of high achievers, you know it doesn't start with one big wound. It starts with 100 small ones, and by the time you realize they've added up, you're already bleeding. I remember the year I won the Regional Nurse Excellence Award. My hospital gave me a plaque. My colleagues threw me a little celebration with cake and balloons, and my director said in front of the entire department that I was the kind of caregiver that made the whole institution better. I cried a little on the drive home. Good tears. Earned tears. And then I called my parents to share the news. My mother said, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Natalie made partner?" That was it. Full stop. No follow-up question, no tell me more, no pause to let my moment breathe. Just a pivot, clean and practiced, back to the daughter who mattered. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. That was the year I stopped expecting anything and started simply documenting the pattern. The way a nurse charts symptoms, quietly, methodically, without flinching. I'd been cheated out of basic recognition so many times it had started to feel like weather. Predictable, unavoidable, something you dress for. There were years of being placed at the wrong table at holidays. Not the wrong seat, the wrong table. The one near the kitchen, where the caterers refilled trays and the noise from the service entrance swallowed conversation. Marcus and I used to joke about it in the car on the way home. "At least we got the warm bread first," he'd say, and I'd laugh, but the laughter had a shelf life. Over time, even dark humor stops working. The shaming had become deliberate, built into the physical space of every family gathering, as natural to my parents as breathing. I tried, at various points, to name what was happening. Once, over coffee, I told my mother that I felt overlooked. She looked at me with this expression of genuine confusion, not guilt, not even discomfort, just confusion. "Claire, we're proud of everything you do." And then she changed the subject. That's a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that refuses to acknowledge itself, that keeps its hands clean by never saying the quiet part loud. It's betrayal dressed in plausible deniability. It's the reason so many people in my situation spend years wondering if they're imagining it. You're not. The truth was right there. I just wasn't ready to say it yet. But something was shifting in me. Slowly, the way seasons turn, and you only notice it when you look back. I had started building a life that didn't require their applause. I had patients who held my hand on their worst days. I had Marcus, who looked at me like I was the most impressive person he'd ever met, and not in a way that felt hollow or performed. I'd never asked the full question about who he really was, and he'd never volunteered the full answer. There was a groundedness to him, a kind of quiet authority that I'd never fully questioned until recently. Small things that didn't quite add up, things I was starting to notice, things that, at the engagement party, would finally make sense in the most public way possible. Here's what I knew about Marcus Shaw when we first started dating. He had a farm outside of Calverton, a beat-up truck he drove everywhere, and a habit of waking up before dawn that I found both admirable and deeply inconvenient. He wore the same 3 flannels in rotation, cooked the most incredible food from scratch, and had a laugh that came from somewhere completely unguarded. He felt like the most real person I'd ever been around. And when my family met him at a birthday dinner 8 months into our relationship, they were polite in the way people are polite when they've already made up their minds. My father shook his hand. My mother smiled. Natalie asked what he did, and when he said farming, she nodded with that special kind of smile that means, "I've already stopped listening." What they didn't know, what I didn't fully know, was that Marcus had a habit of understating things, not in a dishonest way. More like, he'd learned somewhere along the way that people treat you differently when they know the full picture, and he'd chosen, carefully, to let people arrive at their own conclusions. I'd noticed small things over the months. A MacBook that was a little too high spec for someone who just ran a farm. A phone call he took outside once, something about a board meeting and quarterly allocations, that he explained away as a thing with some local agricultural committee. The way he talked about soil science, water rights, and land preservation, not like a hobbyist, but like someone who'd testified about it. The inconsistencies were there. I just hadn't assembled them into a picture yet. Marcus never flaunted anything. He drove past a billboard once. It had his last name on it, Shaw Family Foundation, connected to a children's nutrition initiative across 3 states, and he didn't say a word. I remember glancing at it and thinking, same name, and moving on. Shaw isn't exactly rare where we live. That's how well he carried it. That's how deliberately quiet he'd made himself. And if I'm being honest, part of me wonders if he was watching to see what I'd love him for, whether it would be the truck and the flannel or something else. I loved him for the truck and the flannel. That seemed to matter to him. But the night of Natalie's engagement party, Marcus wore a suit. A real one, not the kind you rent for weddings, but the kind that's been fitted and pressed by someone who does it for a living. I noticed it and raised an eyebrow. He just smiled and said, "Figured I'd make an effort." I thought he was being sweet, trying to fit in, maybe for my sake. What I didn't realize, not yet, was that Marcus wasn't dressing up for my family. He already sensed something about that evening, some unspoken tension in the air that I hadn't fully read yet. And the calm in his eyes wasn't nerves managed well. It was the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are, no matter what room you walk into. That calm of his stayed with me through cocktail hour, through my mother's little "just a nurse" comment, through the polite laughs that rippled around us like something cruel disguised as charm. Marcus held my hand. He didn't tense up, didn't argue, didn't try to defend us. He just watched. And it was only later, much later, that I understood what he was doing. He was waiting, patiently, precisely, the way you wait when you already know the room is about to rearrange itself around a truth that nobody expected to walk through the door. I found out about the seating chart by accident. Or maybe fate has a petty sense of humor, I haven't decided. I'd slipped away from the pre-dinner mingling to find a quiet corner and check on a patient remotely. There was a post-op situation I was monitoring, something only I would do at my own sister's engagement party, which tells you everything. On my way back through the side corridor near the venue's planning room, the door was slightly open. I heard my mother's voice first, then the event coordinator's, and then my own name. Claire and her boyfriend. Put them at table 9, near the back, close to the exit. We don't want them near the head table. There it was. Not ambiguous, not a seating preference framed diplomatically, a deliberate act of erasure, spoken casually, the way you'd discuss table linens. I stood in that corridor for a moment longer than I should have. My brain kept replaying it, looking for a charitable interpretation that wasn't there. There wasn't one. This was the anatomy of family betrayal laid bare, not in a fight, not in a confrontation, but in a logistics call made behind closed doors. The seating chart betrayal hit differently than the public comments. See, when someone humiliates you publicly, there's a witness, there's heat, there's electricity. You can almost work with it. But when someone erases you in private, when the decision to diminish you is made quietly and with planning, that tells you something colder, that the dismissal isn't reactionary. It isn't impatience or thoughtlessness. It's policy. My family had a policy about me. They'd been enforcing it for years, and I had been showing up anyway, like someone who keeps trying a locked door because they can't accept that the lock was changed on purpose. I went back to the party. I found Marcus talking to one of Natalie's soon-to-be in-laws, and I slid my arm through his without saying a word. He looked at me, really looked, and asked quietly, "You okay?" I said yes. I wasn't, but I also wasn't broken. Something had shifted in me in that corridor. The grief of it was real, but underneath the grief was something sharper, something that had been building for years without a name. I think it was the moment I stopped asking to be seen and started, very quietly, becoming something that could not be ignored. We found table 9 without being told. Near the exit, just like she'd planned, close enough to the catering door that we could hear the kitchen staff talking. Marcus sat down, unfolded his napkin with this particular kind of deliberateness, and glanced around the room. Then he looked at me with something close to a smile, not amused, not sad, just calm. "Good table," he said, like he meant it. I didn't understand why he meant it. Not yet. But I was about to, because someone across that room had just spotted him from his seat, And then I saw him stand up slowly, and the air changed. The Whitman estate, where Natalie's engagement party was held, was the kind of place that made you feel like your posture wasn't quite right when you walked in. High ceilings with original plasterwork, a grand staircase wrapped in white florals, chandeliers that cast everything in honey and gold. It was spectacular, and it was specifically designed to communicate that the people who gathered here were a particular kind of people. My family had hired out the East Wing. My father had arrived early to personally greet the Ellsworths. The whole evening had been staged like a production, and I was, as always, somewhere in the back of the playbill, listed under miscellaneous. Dinner started smoothly enough. The food was beautiful, the wine was generous, and the conversation around table 9 was actually warm. Marcus had a way of making any setting feel comfortable, and the 2 other couples placed near us were lovely, if a little confused by why we'd been seated so far from the family. Then came the toasts. My father stood, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone with authority commands it. He was wearing his best suit. He had that look, practiced, presidential, the one that said he'd written something and rehearsed it and believed every word. He talked about legacy, about what it meant to raise daughters with purpose. He praised Natalie for nearly 4 minutes, her career, her drive, her match with Thomas Ellsworth, whom he called a young man of exceptional character. It was genuinely moving, actually, and for about 30 seconds I felt something close to warmth, the kind of familial hope you never fully let go of no matter how many times it's burned you. And then he said it, almost an aside, almost gentle. And our Claire, well, she's found her own kind of contentment. That was it. Contentment. Like my life was a participation trophy. Like 13 years of nursing, night shifts, and saving actual lives was something I'd settled for. The word landed in my chest like a stone. Around me, the applause for Natalie swelled, toasts were raised, and somewhere at the head table, my mother caught my eye for just a fraction of a second. Not with guilt, with something closer to satisfaction. That was the moment I truly understood the difference between people who are careless with others and people who are deliberate about it. My parents weren't oblivious. They weren't clumsy with their cruelty. They knew exactly what that toast communicated. They'd been communicating it, in 100 small ways, for years. The truth of it settled into me, clear and cold and oddly liberating. Marcus had been quiet through the whole toast. He'd sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. But as the applause faded and the dinner resumed, I noticed something happening across the room. A man, older, silver-haired, clearly of some standing, had turned his head toward our table with an expression I didn't understand yet. He was staring at Marcus. Not rudely, not in passing, staring, with the specific, focused look of someone who has recognized something completely unexpected in a completely unexpected place. He set his glass down, and he started moving toward us. He moved through the room the way people with real authority do, unhurried, certain, parting conversations without effort. I recognized him by the time he was halfway across the floor. Judge William Hartley, the soon-to-be father-in-law of my sister Natalie, one of the most respected appellate judges in the state, a man whose name I'd seen on courthouse walls and op-eds about judicial reform. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures, and he was the one man in that room my parents would never dare underestimate. Which is exactly why every person in his orbit noticed when he extended his hand across table 9, not to my father, not to anyone at the head table, but directly to Marcus. "Daniel Shaw," he said. Not a question, a recognition. Marcus stood, slowly, no theatrics, and shook the judge's hand with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done it before. I felt him settle almost imperceptibly. Daniel. His given name, the one he'd never offered my family, the one that belonged to a version of him they'd never bothered to look for. "Judge Hartley," he said simply. "It's been a while." The table had gone still. I looked at Marcus, This man I'd introduced to my family as my boyfriend who works with agriculture. And I saw something in his posture I hadn't cataloged before. A kind of settled authority, the way a person holds themselves when they know exactly who they are and have no need to explain it. My mother, who had appeared beside the judge to make some social navigation move, went noticeably pale. What followed happened in stages, like dominoes arranged in a line you didn't know existed until they started falling. Judge Hartley, without any apparent intention of causing chaos, simply in the manner of someone making conversation, mentioned the Shaw Family Foundation, the initiatives, the Senate Agriculture Committee testimony Marcus had given, the National Rural Health Access Program the foundation had co-funded. With each sentence, the radius of silence around our table widened. My father had materialized somewhere behind my mother. Natalie stood at a distance with her mouth barely open. And Marcus, my Marcus, stood there receiving it all with a patience that suggested he'd been carrying this particular moment in his back pocket for a while. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and yet some deeper, quieter part of me could believe it perfectly. Every inconsistency snapped into place, every careful understatement, every moment he'd steered a conversation with the precision of someone who'd been in high-level rooms. The poor farmer my family had dismissed, the man they'd placed at table 9 near the service exit, was the chairman of a foundation with a national footprint, a person Judge Hartley clearly considered a peer. The karma of that moment was almost architectural. My family had constructed a hierarchy in that room, and now it was reorganizing itself around a truth they'd refused to look for. My father started to say something. I don't even remember exactly what. Something composed and damage-controlling, something in his attorney voice. But Judge Hartley, gently and without malice, redirected. He said he'd heard wonderful things about me from a colleague at my hospital. He said the work I did was, in his words, the kind of work that actually keeps society functional. He said it warmly, conversationally, not as a speech, but in a room that had gone quiet enough that every word carried. And I watched my parents' faces in that moment, not with triumph, with something that felt, finally, like the truth breathing in an open room. The thing about justice, real justice, not the cinematic kind, is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with music or a gavel. It arrives in the middle of a dinner party, in the form of a silver-haired judge saying something factual to someone who happens to be surrounded by the right witnesses. That's what happened in the East Wing of the Whitman estate, in front of approximately 60 people who had spent the earlier part of the evening accepting my family's version of the truth without question. Judge Hartley didn't deliver a verdict. He simply introduced the actual facts, and the actual facts were enough. Marcus spoke then, and I want to be clear, he didn't grandstand. He didn't list credentials or correct anyone with visible satisfaction. He talked about nursing the way someone talks about something they genuinely respect, as essential infrastructure, as the difference between a healthcare system that functions and one that fails. He mentioned quietly that he'd co-funded a rural nursing initiative in 3 counties specifically because he'd seen firsthand how little support frontline nurses received and how enormous the consequence of that gap was. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, simply directly, with none of the performance that wealth often wears to dinner parties. My mother tried once to redirect, something about the engagement, something cheerful and pivoting. Judge Hartley listened politely and then said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. The most impressive people in any room are rarely the loudest ones. He wasn't looking at my parents when he said it. He wasn't looking at Natalie. He was looking at me. And something in that eye contact, brief, direct, felt like a hand reaching across years of being invisible and pulling me gently into view. The betrayal had been public. So, quietly, was the vindication. What I felt in that moment was complicated. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story says I felt triumphant and vindicated and full of fire. And I did feel those things. But underneath them was grief, real and deep, because the truth was that none of this should have required a judge's recognition or a foundation's name to be valid. I should have been enough just by showing up, just by the life I'd built on my own terms. The vengeance was sweet, in the way truth being seen always is. But it was also a reminder of how long I'd been denied it. And that part didn't feel like winning. It felt like being handed something that should have been mine all along. My father stood quietly through most of it. My mother touched her pearls, which is what she does when she's recalibrating. Around us, conversations had resumed, but in that low, buzzing way that means everyone is still tuned to the same frequency. I could feel eyes on me, not the mocking kind, not the dismissive kind, but the kind that come with reassessment. People were looking at me differently, and the strange, sore thing about that? It made me realize how long I'd been living inside a story that other people had written about me, and how little of it had ever been true. I've replayed what happened next more times than I can count, and every time I do, I'm a little surprised by my own steadiness. I expected myself to cry. I expected the dam to break, all those years of being shamed and sidelined collapsing into a very public, very inconvenient flood. But when I finally spoke, when I looked at my parents and said the things I'd been quietly composing for a decade, my voice was level. Not cold, not performed, just clear. The kind of clear that comes when you've stopped hoping to be understood and started simply telling the truth for your own sake. I told them I was willing to let go of the weight, not the accountability. I told them that I was proud of my career, that my patients' recoveries mattered more to me than any plaque on any wall, and that the life Marcus and I had built together, both the parts they'd seen and the parts they'd dismissed, was more real and more meaningful than anything their prestige had ever given me. I said it without drama. I said it in the voice of someone who had finally stopped asking for a door to open and decided to walk through a different one entirely. Marcus stood beside me through all of it. He didn't add to what I said. He didn't need to. His presence was the punctuation. The man my family had placed at table 9, near the service exit, because they didn't think he belonged, stood at the center of that room in a way that made the original seating arrangement feel almost prophetic in its wrongness. Dignity doesn't always arrive loudly, but when it does, it takes up the whole room. And something about walking out of that party, unhurried with my hand in his, felt like the first time I'd stood fully upright in years. We didn't make a scene leaving. I hugged no one, declined the goodbye rounds, and left through the main entrance. Not the exit near table 9, the front door. The one that opened onto the estate's lit driveway, with the sound of the party still drifting out behind us. Marcus opened the car door without saying anything, and I sat down, and the moment the door closed, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 15 years. Not crying, just releasing. The payback I had fantasized about in my worst moments never looked like this. I'd imagined grand speeches and dramatic reversals, but what actually happened was quieter and somehow more complete. I had simply refused to be small anymore, and in that refusal, I'd already won. There was a strange lightness to the drive home. We didn't talk much. Marcus put on music, something low and instrumental, and I watched the city lights slide past the window. I kept thinking about my mother's face when Judge Hartley had spoken, the way she'd touched her pearls, the micro-expression of something she'd never name publicly but couldn't quite hide. And I thought, the truth has a way of taking up space, even in rooms that weren't built for it, especially in those rooms. Whatever came next, whatever fallout, whatever conversations, whatever version of accountability my family was capable of, I was no longer bracing for it. I was walking toward it with my chin up, and that, for now, was enough. I want to say the fallout happened slowly, like justice in real life usually does. But the tremors started within 72 hours. Not full departures at first, but something quieter and more telling. Inquiries. Clients calling to Revisit the terms of representation. A senior partner at my father's firm asking questions that didn't have comfortable answers. In the world of estate law and reputation management, word travels the way it always has, across dinner tables and golf courses and whispered conversations between people who attended the same party and saw the same thing. By the end of the week, 3 clients had formally withdrawn. The ground had shifted. My father felt every inch of it. My mother heard from the charity board she'd sat on for 6 years. Not a removal, something more sophisticated, a restructuring of leadership roles that resulted in her stepping back from her committee chair position. Again, politely framed. Again, connected to nothing and everything that had happened at the Whitman estate. She called me twice that week. I let it go to voicemail both times. I wasn't ready to talk, not because I was punishing her, but because I had nothing to say yet that wouldn't either beg for the reconciliation I didn't need or weaponize the pain I was still processing. Both felt beneath what I was trying to become. Natalie's wedding planning hit unexpected friction, too. The Ellsworth family, Judge Hartley's people, had grown noticeably cooler since the party. Not hostile, just recalibrated. Thomas was still engaged to Natalie, still committed, but there were conversations happening between the families that hadn't been planned. I heard about this secondhand, from a cousin who meant well. The engagement wasn't broken, but the wedding timeline had shifted, the venue discussions paused. Natalie, from what I was told, was shaken in a way she'd never publicly admit. She'd spent years being the golden child, the successful one, the daughter who was introduced first at parties. The idea that her own trajectory could be complicated by her family's treatment of the other daughter. That hadn't been in any of the plans. I felt something complicated about all of this, and I think it's worth naming. I didn't set out to destroy anything. I hadn't orchestrated an exposure or tipped off anyone or made a single call. What happened was simply that the truth had been seen by people with long memories and clear eyes, and those people had made their own assessments. That's not revenge in the scheming sense. That's karma, the kind that operates on its own timeline, in its own currency, without needing your permission or your involvement. I'd been told for years that the world ran on prestige and performance. Turns out it also runs on character. And character, unlike reputation, isn't something you can manage from the outside. By day 5, my father had called 3 times. His voicemails started formal and shifted gradually into something that sounded, if I squinted, like a man trying to find an opening that didn't require him to admit he was wrong. That particular style of non-apology was so familiar it almost made me nostalgic. Almost. I played the last message twice, listening for something real underneath the professional cadence. There was something there. Small, buried, but there. And that tiny, buried thing was the reason I didn't delete the number. Because somewhere beneath all of it, the prestige, the seating charts, the toast about contentment, those were still my parents. And I still had to figure out what, if anything, I wanted to do about that. When I finally agreed to meet with my parents, it was on my terms, not theirs. That distinction mattered more to me than I can fully explain, because for most of my life, the terms had always been theirs. Their schedule, their setting, their comfort level, their pace of conversation. This time, I sent a text. 3 conditions. First, a licensed family therapist present, pre-selected, not one their attorney had vetted. Second, they listened fully before responding. No interrupting, no redirecting, no pivoting to Natalie or to reputation or to what this looks like. Third, this was not a conversation about repairing the image. It was a conversation about whether repair was even possible. Those were the conditions. I sent it on a Tuesday and gave them until Friday. They agreed by Thursday morning. That alone was information. The therapist I found, Dr. Camille Reyes, a specialist in family estrangement and emotional accountability, had a practice on the 3rd floor of a quiet building downtown. When I walked into that first session, I was calm in the way you're calm before something significant. Not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. My parents arrived together, which I'd expected. My mother was dressed down, which I hadn't expected. No jewelry, just a blazer, something in her expression that I'd never seen before in a formal setting. It looked almost against my instincts like effort. My father spoke first. He started with something close to an apology. Not perfect, not clean, but real enough to be uncomfortable for him, which is how I could tell it was real. Of course, someone had filmed the toast. They always do at events like this. And a family friend had quietly shared it. He said he'd watched it. He'd heard himself say contentment. He said quietly that he didn't recognize himself in it. My mother cried, not for the room, but actually cried, dabbing her eyes in a way that wasn't performed. I sat with it. I didn't soften it for them or harden it for myself. I just let it be what it was. What I said to them in that room is between us and Dr. Reyes. But I will tell you this. I didn't go in to grant absolution or to burn anything down. I went in as someone who had spent years being made to feel that her choices, her career, her person were insufficient, and who needed finally to say that out loud in a space where it couldn't be redirected or minimized. The self-worth I'd been quietly building outside of their approval deserved to be spoken in front of them, directly, not just proved to them through Marcus's foundation or Judge Hartley's recognition. I needed to be the one who said it. And I was. We scheduled a second session for the following week. One session does not fix a decades-long pattern. Dr. Reyes said something at the end of the hour that I've carried since. Progress in estranged families doesn't look like resolution. It looks like sustained discomfort in the direction of honesty. I wrote that down in my phone on the way to the parking garage. I didn't know yet exactly what my family was capable of changing, but I knew, with a clarity I hadn't had before, that whatever happened next, I would be the one setting the terms. And if you thought that first session was intense, you have no idea what came out in the second one. There's a specific kind of freedom that doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't feel like a celebration, not at first. It feels like quiet. Like the absence of a noise you'd stopped noticing because it had been there so long. That's what the weeks after the party felt like. A gradual, spreading quiet where the hum of their disapproval used to live. I'd spent so long adjusting my life around the possibility of their acceptance that I hadn't fully noticed how much space that adjustment was taking up. And now, with the dust settling and the therapy sessions underway, and the consequences of that night still rippling through my family's social world, I woke up one morning and realized I was okay. Not performing okay. Actually okay. My patients didn't know any of this had happened, and that, weirdly, was its own comfort. I showed up to my shifts, I did the work, I held hands and answered questions and monitored vitals and had the kinds of conversations that actually matter. The ones in hospital rooms at 3 a.m. when someone needs to not be alone. And not once, in any of those moments, did I need my parents to have seen the Nurse of the Year plaque for it to be real. The dignity of the work had never required their recognition. I'd just spent years pretending it did. That was on me as much as it was on them, and owning that part felt important too. Marcus and I talked more, in those weeks, than we had in months. Not about the party or the fallout or the foundation, but about what we actually wanted. The life we were building, not as a response to anyone else's narrative, but as its own thing. He told me, one evening over dinner at his kitchen table, that he'd known who he was for a long time, but that being with me had made him more certain of what he valued. He said it simply, the way he said everything simple. And I thought, this is what reclaiming yourself looks like. Not the grand gesture, not the public vindication, though that had its moment. This, a kitchen table, a real conversation, the absence of performance. I'm not going to pretend the family situation is resolved. It isn't. Therapy is slow and real, and sometimes it makes things harder before it makes them better. My mother sent me a card, an actual handwritten card, no occasion, just a few sentences about how she wanted to understand me better. I read it twice. I put it on my nightstand. I haven't responded yet. That's not cruelty. It's pacing, giving myself time to respond from a place of genuine intention rather than relief or anger. There's a version of this story where I forgive everything cleanly and we all gather for holidays and nothing echoes. I don't know if that's our story. But I know the version where I kept shrinking myself to fit their frame isn't our story anymore either. What I know, with a certainty I haven't felt in years, is that my worth was never theirs to grant. Not my father's, with his toasts. Not my mother's, with her seating charts. Not the room full of guests who looked at table 9 and made their assumptions. I know what I've built. I know who shows up for people in their most vulnerable hours and does it well. I know the man who stood beside me, calm and certain, because he saw something real. The justice of that night wasn't just about being seen by Judge Hartley or watching my parents lose clients or seeing Natalie's wedding timeline wobble. The real justice was internal. The moment I stopped waiting for the verdict and started living the acquittal. As for the second therapy session, let's just say something came out that nobody in that room was prepared for. And if you think you know where this family's story ends, stay close. Because we're just getting started. So, here we are. At the end of a story that doesn't quite have an ending yet, because real life never ties a bow on things the way we'd like it to. The therapy sessions are continuing. My family is somewhere in the middle of choosing between real change and reputation management, and I'm watching carefully to see which one wins. Marcus is still driving the beat-up truck. I'm still showing up to my night shifts. And somehow, on the other side of all of it, I feel more like myself than I have in years. But here's what I want to know about you. Because I don't think I'm alone in this. Not even close. Have you ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to see you most? Have you ever sat at the wrong table, literally or figuratively, while someone else got the toast, the applause, the recognition you'd quietly earned? Have you ever had a moment where the truth finally came out in front of exactly the right witnesses and felt that complicated mix of relief and grief all at once? I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments below. Your story matters. And not just to me. There are people watching right now who need to read what you've been through. And I want to ask you something even more specific. At what point do you think accountability becomes possible in a family like mine? Is it ever too late? Or is the real question whether the people who hurt you are capable of choosing discomfort over defense? Tell me where you stand. Tell me what you've seen. Tell me if you've ever walked out of a room and felt for the first time like you were finally the right size. If this story moved something in you, if any part of it felt familiar in a way you've never seen reflected back before, then you already know there's more coming. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because what I'm building here isn't just content. It's a space for people who've been seated at table 9 their whole lives and are finally ready to talk about it. The next episode? Let's just say the second therapy session brought something to the surface that nobody in that room, including me, saw coming. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you there.